Fallout Equestria Pure Hearts. Chapter 2 New Worlds. And that's how Equestria was made. As my vision adjusted to the new light, I felt my jaw drop and my stomach churn. What our eyes were met with was nothing but awe-inspiring. A vast expanse with rock walls that seemed to rise for miles on either side of us. Real, natural plants populated the area, as few as they were, and a trickle of water flowed through the canyon's center. But the most dizzying thing to behold was the great grey ceiling that seemed to stretch forever onward, enveloping the land. We had learned a lot about the old world in classes, but no amount of knowledge would ever compare to this actual experience of being here. As much as I dreamt of leaving the stable before, my imagination failed to come up with terms for this new reality. I suddenly felt a fear of the immense size of this place grip me. Choking down that fear, I turned to Lily Bloom to see on her face that she was just as awestruck as I was. I then noticed on the inside of the door near the top was a sign that read, Stable-Tec Trademark Stable, number 61. Location, Galloping Gorge. Lily, come here. She shook her head in order to return herself to reality and trotted over to where I was standing. What's up? Look at this. It says we're in Galloping Gorge. Ring any bells? I don't recall learning anything about it in class. Galloping Gorge. Galloping Gorge. She repeated this a number of times, running it through her mind. As she did so, she tapped her hoof on her chin. I do remember reading something in the back of the archives about it. It honestly didn't surprise me that she had been in the back of the archives, the classified archives, probably hacked into them someday during her free time for the hay of it. Well, what did they say? Not much. That was helpful, Lily, I thought to myself. They did say, though, that it was some kind of natural formation near an old city called Van Hoofer. It could be that if we get out of here, we may find something to point us in that direction. I nodded in agreement. Lily told me that Van Hoofer would be to the west, and I checked my new Pip-Buck's compass, a feature whose purpose I never understood in the stable, and orientated myself with the direction that indicated west, straight up the cliff in front of us. I also noticed that my new Pip-Buck, to my surprise, had updated its map to reflect our immediate surroundings, and two labels appeared on our location, one for Stable 61 and one for Galloping Gorge. I had no idea how I was capable of this, but I made sure to remember how useful this feature would be for later. Assuming you're right, it should be this way, I indicated with my hoof. Shall we look for a way up the cliff? Lily seemed to think about it for a moment before nodding her head in agreement. We began scanning the rock for any potential way up. There, she shouted after a few seconds. I followed her view to a point in the wall. I spotted what she was looking at. A little way down the canyon was a small path that wound its way up the cliff face. We wasted no time in deciding that was where we were heading. We both took one last look at the wooden door we had emerged from. As we closed it again, it sadly creaked shut, and I shed a tear. We were leaving our friends, our family, our home, and everything else we've ever known behind. It was a longer walk to the path's trailhead than we expected, though. When we did finally get there, we paused for a few minutes to rest. So good so far, I said, pulling out my canteen and taking a drink. Lily bowed her head in agreement as she swallowed the water she had retrieved from her own bottle. The path here now looked a lot bigger, at least at this level, than it appeared before. We really needed to work on estimating scale in this much larger world. And now we climb up and up and up. Want to race at the top? Typical Lily, she just had to make a game out of everything, even when things she wasn't good at, like physical trials. Of course, I wanted to take things a little more seriously, but before I could respond, she had already bolted off. I would have just ended up talking to a vaguely pony-shaped dust cloud. Sighing and rolling my eyes, I chased off after her. It wasn't long before I realized that racing wasn't going to be a smart idea. The path up the cliffside was rough going, rugged and warm. It quickly narrowed to a point where we had to proceed with caution, single file, one hoof at a time. We made our way along the rock wall. The elevation from the floor of the gorge was now quite head-spinning, and we were only halfway up. I didn't think that I was afraid of heights, but it was much higher than anything the stable had been, and there was still more to go. Taking a deep breath, I pushed onward, with Lily in tow. My vision was focused on the path ahead, looking neither up nor down on the rock face. What I couldn't see, though, was what lay beneath me, as my hoof made contact with what must have been its 1,000th or 2,000th contact with the ground. I felt it shift more than it should have. I stepped on what must have been an overhang, where the ground beneath the non-threatening surface had eroded down the steep slopes. The earth gave way around me, and it took me down with it. I thought I was surely gone, but my freefall was brought to a halt. Watching the dirt crumble on the ground below me, I felt a pain in my rear quarters as I dangled down in the new gap. Lily had my tail in her mouth, and despite using her magic to assist in her endeavour, she was struggling against the odds to hold me there. Continuing myself to face away from the rock behind me, I put hooves to the vertical face and backpedaled upward. Assisted by Lily, I finally felt the soft dirt beneath the path on my hooves again. Breathing a sigh of relief, I was glad to be back in that narrow trail, even more glad to see Lily was quick enough to act. Turning to her, I saw she was doing her best to catch her breath. "Thanks," I said. "I thought I was going to be a pancake right out of the stable." "Don't," her words slow, intermixed with deep breathing as she tried to catch her breath. "Don't mention it. That's what friends are for." I smiled. "I'm really glad that it was you that got picked to come with me." Her breathing returned to normal. She smiled back at me. "Now how are we going to get across this gap?" As I shifted towards our new dilemma. The open fall between where we stood on the other side was too wide to jump across confidently, and there was no other way up to the top of the gorge I could see. I then caught sight of something that might have saved our efforts. "Lily, I've got a question for you." Getting back on her hooves, she trotted over to me. "How far can you reach with your magic?" "I would imagine that if I've seen it clearly once, I can reach it." "Why?" Confusion was evident in her voice, but it subsided when I explained my idea. "The wooden doors of the stable entrance. If you can use your magic from here to unhinge it and float it up to us, could we use it as a bridge?" "I dunno, Dovetail. I'm better with small things." "It's worth a shot, though, right? Consider it a challenge." I knew Lily was the type who liked a challenge, and she proved me right. Her air of overconfidence returned almost immediately. Challenge accepted. Her horn began to glow a green glow with her magic, and after a moment, so did the door far below. At first, nothing happened. The door didn't budge. I could hear Lily straining to manipulate its weight, her horn now beginning to spark as she continued to focus on it. The amount of concentration and effort she put into it was admirable, though. I was about to tell her to stop, but I held my words as I saw the door began to shift. The movement was minimal at first, just jitters back and forth, but slowly it escalated. And then we heard the first hinge give way, breaking under the pressure, and then the other. The door was now loose, and from its hold, suspended by my friend's magical glow. I heard her exhale as the hardest part was over and she could focus on moving the thing through the air towards us. The closer it got to us, the easier it seemed to be for her. I wasn't sure if it was because of the proximity or if it was just her confidence increasing, but either way, I was proud of her. Once the door was finally in place, I tested its integrity by putting my hoof on it gently at first. This time I wasn't taking any chances of falling to my death. As I slowly applied pressure to it, I felt it give a little under me. But despite its age and the rot in the wood, it held strong. I put another hoof on it, and then another. Though it groaned with the majority of my weight on it, I did eventually manage to fully stand on it. Once I was certain it wasn't going to break, I quickly scurried across the other side. Lily quickly followed suit. At one point she did put her hoof through a bad spot in the wood, but she caught herself and kept going like nothing happened. Her last hoof step on the door came down, however. The wood finally resigned itself and broke apart. Lily scrambled a bit to keep from slipping down the cliff face with it, but she was safe. As we watched it crash down the slope, I mentally thanked it for holding on long enough for us to cross. When it hit the bottom, we both turned without a second glance and pushed onwards and upwards. The rest of the trek was relatively peaceful. The trail may have been just as rough, but somehow it didn't bother me as much as nearly plummeting to my death. Eventually, we reached the top. Cresting over to the flat ground above, something new took hold of my senses. Disgust, fear, wonder, shock, and a disturbing confusion all rolled up into one big jumble of emotion. The scene that stretched out across the landscape was something out of a horror film. Directly in front of us, what seemed to be some form of housing, what Lily called cabins, and scattered about was what I assumed were fire pits. My pit book registered it as a pre-war campground named after the gorge. It was a place where families once came for fun and recreation. Now it was silent and desolate. Beyond the remains, however, it got worse. The land was scorched and almost lifeless. The hills rolled on like waves across the terrain, and to look to one part of a lively forest, probably teeming with animals and plants. The sight before us was a different story. What had once been a bountiful woodland is now an arid grassland. The soil still seemed to be very fertile, and the dry grass barely struggled to survive across all the plains. Dead trees littered the area, stumps and fallen logs strewn without, though a few still clung to life here and there. The war had not been kind to nature here, but it hadn't killed off everything either. The only thing that seemed to be keeping life here from returning to its former glory was the ever-present cloud that blocked out much of the light from above. I felt my stomach turn once again. I wanted to so badly to have been able to save it all. I wanted to see it the way it was before. Now I can only picture it in my mind, like I had done so many times in my imagination, and it was beautiful. But the harsh reality of the matter of that Equestria had become a wasteland. What happened while we were locked away in safety? I asked aloud, although neither of us could even begin to imagine what took place here after the stable doors sealed. Then, in the distance, something caught my eye. It looked like to be another pony, silhouetted on the horizon. I pointed Lily's head in the direction with my hoof just before it moved, disappearing over the hills. "You saw that, right?" I asked her. "Yeah, what was it?" "It looked like another pony. Maybe some pony from a different stable?" "Maybe. We should go to find out." My stomach answered the question for me. A loud growl emanated from my gut. Lily must have heard it too, because she giggled at me playfully. We'd eaten a couple of hours before we left, but our physical exertion had used up a lot of the energy the meal had provided. "Oh, hush," I told her. "Don't tell me you're not hungry as well." She didn't even respond before her stomach echoed mine. "I guess I am," she chuckled. "Let's get something to eat, then we should investigate the figure in the distance," I suggested, sliding my saddlebags off my back and opening them up. I realized something was dreadfully wrong. There was no food in my bags. The protocol for the scouting parties that Stable-Tec had provided for us made no mention of food. I guess they figured those in the party would be smart enough to pack their own sustenance, and I must have overlooked its necessity in my nervousness of leaving. Lily informed me that she had made the same error as she rooted around in her bags, mumbling to herself, "Stupid, stupid, stupid! How could you have forgotten something so important?" I began running things through my mind, finding a solution. We could go back to the stable to get some. No, there was the gap in the path now. We weren't going back that way. The land, even with the plants that still clung to life, was too barren to even consider harvesting anything. So that wasn't going to be an option. Then Lily's voice cut in. "We could search the cabins for food," she suggested. "They don't look like they've been touched in ages. I'm sure there's something to eat." No, my response was more swift and resolute than I had thought it would be. I hadn't considered it a possibility until now, but the cabins probably did contain some sort of food. Still, something didn't feel right about it. I won't defile this property, even if its residents are long dead. Besides, the food is probably so old now it's no longer any good. Oh, come on, Dove. I know you hold your moral standards high, but you also need to eat. You said it yourself, though. Any of the residents are probably long dead. Who's gonna miss it? And some food we had in the stable is just as old and still good. Sure, it may be a little more deteriorated, but it will still have fared decently. I mean, they did pack their boxes with more preservatives than food sometimes." I sighed, knowing that she was right. My stomach rumbled once more, and I felt the pain in it this time. Swallowing my pride, I walked over to one of the old buildings, Lily trotting up beside me. The cabin's walls were put together with nothing more than logs arranged on top of each other, interlocking at the corners. It was rotten, much like the doors of the tunnel that had led into the stable. But it was entirely solid. The glass was mostly intact too. This place really hadn't been touched since the war. I only assumed it was due to the sheer remoteness of this locale. "Fine, Lily, you win." Attempting to turn the handle, the door lock refused me entry. I would have tried to pick it, but neither Lily nor I had the skill. That didn't matter, though. A pale green blur and a resounding thud later, and the door broke free of its rusty hinges, falling to the floor with a crash. Lily had turned and bucked the door as hard as she could, knocking it free. "Ever heard of subtlety?" I joked. She scoffed a little and rolled her eyes a bit, and then made her way into the open doorway. I hesitated a moment before going in following her, still wrestling with my objections to this whole situation. As I entered, the stale air touched my nose. All the odors of the abode came at me at once. It proved overwhelming to my mind. I grew lightheaded for a moment and stumbled backwards a bit. One of the smells was stronger than the rest and much more vile. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew I didn't care for it. Inside the cabin was dark and dreary, with the only source of illumination being the gloomy lights that entered through the dingy windows. It wasn't that different from the metal walls, dim bulbs, and sterile environment of the stable, come to think about it. The log walls continued from the outside, the decorations were very much old world, and the appliances were of a lower quality. Definitely not the high-tech gadgets back home. There wasn't much in the way of furniture, however, but I dismissed it as only being a recreational retreat instead of some pony's personal home. No need for necessary clutter when one was only intended to stay for a couple of days. But then I saw the most disturbing thing in here, the source of that abhorrent smell. Lying on the beds, all curled up in a sleeping position, was a pony. Only it wasn't a pony anymore. Wrapped up in the blankets, the decaying skeleton of a now nameless soul slept peacefully. The sight had made me heave, but I held my bile down and quickly turned away from it in disgust and back to Lily. She obviously hadn't noticed the cabin's third occupant, as she was still hard at work going through the cabinets, pulling out any food she found and organizing it all on the counter. There were things I recognized from the stable, though the packages were deteriorated and covered in dust. I still wasn't sure if the 2 centuries-old contents would be like. If they were at least tolerable, they would keep us alive. So far she had only found a meager amount of things, but it would be enough at least for a day, maybe more if we rationed it well. When she finished, we packed it all into our saddlebags and started to walk back out the door. Before I stepped fully out, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. "One second, Lily, I'll be right there," I called to her as I went back into the cabin. Over by the dead pony's bed, standing up against the corner of the wall, was an old pump-action shotgun, probably belonging to the sleeping skeleton. and it still looked to be in working order. A box of shotgun shells sat on the floor next to it. I wasn't one for resolving conflict with weapons. I'd much rather solve things with diplomacy if possible, but it figured it'd be nice to have something more than my security pistol in case we needed it. I picked it up and slung it round my neck, slipping the box of shells into my bag. I then sat next to the bed, still slightly disgusted. The pony's bones were the same shade of white I would imagined in pictures and books. They seemed to be well preserved, though, thanks to the relative safety of the cabin provided by the elements. I couldn't tell if it had been a mare or a stallion, nor did I really care to know. I simply closed my eyes and pulled the covers over it as a sign of respect, and simply to hide it from view. "Thank you, I'll take care of it," I said softly, even though I knew the pony couldn't hear my words. Exiting the cabin, Lily took one look at my acquisition and immediately asked where I got it. When I explained, she seemed appalled at the idea of the dead pony laying there without even noticing. She did agree with my reasons behind taking it, though. I still felt wrong about looting from these ponies' centuries-old belongings, but it was evident to me now that if we are going to have to, we wanted to at least last the week the Overmight gave us out here. We continued to loot the remaining cabins until our saddlebags were full. I continued to silently protest myself how wrong this was, but I couldn't come up with a good reason to stop beyond my own moral views. Now we had a couple of bandages, 2 healing potions, and enough food to last us almost the entire week. When we finished packing everything away, we sat down with one of the fire pits and pulled out some of our new food to eat. Looking over the box I had grabbed, the red parcel was decorated with an image of the contents inside, and fancy text that said, "Dandy cold apples." Uh-oh, better get some apples. I chuckled a bit at the thought of the ponies scrambling to the store before the war and nasty, and the mega spells dropped in a frantic effort just to get apples. Opening the box, I found its contents to be a little less appealing than the packaging made it look. The bite-sized apples inside appeared to be badly rotted after 200 years of sitting around, even with the amount of preservatives that are in. Their skins were brown and revolting, and the smell was horribly rancid. The very idea of putting something that disgusting in my body made me cringe. I suddenly wished we thought to get a bigger meal before we had left the stable. However, I doubted that any of the food we have would be much better, so I ponied up and swallowed a couple as quickly as I could. It wasn't quick enough, though. The intense flavor still made my taste buds cry out in delight. It tasted exactly as I imagined it would have right off the shelf, so I kept eating until the box was empty. Lily was having the same issues as with the food's age, but I imagine that she also had the same shocking experience as I did when she tried to eat them. She continued eating until there was nothing but air in her box as well. Our pit box began to click a little bit. Looking down at mine, I indicated a slight increase at the irradiation level in my body. The food must have been irradiated either from the war or being dosed with a small amount from the factory to help preserve it. It was only a negligible amount, however, but we would have to be careful with how much of this stuff we ate. Small amounts of anything can add up quickly if you aren't careful. My stomach was no longer hurting now, feeling full again, or at least significantly less hungry than before. I couldn't tell which it was. I brought up the pit book to my eyes. It was still only 2 p.m. The soft, diffused light above had moved along in the sky from east to west, and I made a mental note of this to help with the directions in the future. Then I remembered the device I had read about, and an idea came to me. The Eyes Forward Sparkle, or EFS for short, was a function of the pit book meant to detect the locations of other creatures, even through walls. It was also able to determine the level of hostility presented by those it detected. We had no real use for it before, with our stable being so small, so I always left it off. I turned the feature on to see if perhaps the shadow on the horizon was anywhere close to us, and a little red mark appeared to the west. Even though I had never seen it before in the stable, I knew exactly what it meant. There was a hostile something nearby. I couldn't be certain if it was the mysterious figure or not. However, when I turned to face its direction, I saw nothing but the deserted hills. "What's up?" Lily asked. Nothing," I said, telling her about the red indicator. "I wouldn't worry about it." "Well, we should still be cautious. Who knows what's out there?" "Agreed. Well, shall we go investigate the mysterious figure? We shall?" He nodded and stood up. I did the same. I gathered my saddlebag and we headed off. My bags felt a good deal heavier than they were before with the food that had been packed into them, and the shotgun added just that much more to the load. But I was an earth pony, so I was naturally a little stronger and heartier than my unicorn friend. It wasn't anything I couldn't handle. The land we traversed was just as interesting as our first impressions made it out to be. The hills rolled gently, yet slowly growing higher. The dry grass blew softly in the wind and made a strangely soothing sound as it rustled about. While it was not the smell of fresh daisies, the breeze carried with it the smells of nature. We had pressed onwards. Large peaks rose in the distance. Still wasn't my dream world, but it was definitely proving to be better than the same monotonous walls of the stable. I had intermittently been watching the red tick of my EFS displayed. It grew brighter and brighter, indicating that whatever it was had gotten closer to us, or us closer to it, depending on how you looked at it. This must have been a new, handy feature of the 4000 model. The manual to my old one only ever mentioned indicators that flashed faster or slower to specify distance. We rounded the top of a hill, and there it was, probably the ugliest thing I'd ever seen, and the source of the mark we'd been following. It looked like an insect of some form, vaguely like the parasprites we had learned about, but also vastly different. The body seemed to be bloated, and long sharp spines encompassed the creature's body. It didn't seem to notice it as it flew about, wings buzzing. I then accidentally kicked a rock, and it quickly turned, shooting one of its spines at us. Fortunately it missed, but only barely. I didn't think I could ever pull a gun on another pony, but this thing was not a pony at all. It was far from it. Plus, it had attacked us first. I drew my pistol out as quickly as I could, cocking it and taking aim at the monstrosity. Being an earth pony, I could manage all of this with my mouth, so I was a little slower than, say, a unicorn would be. And I suffered for it. Before I could fire off a shot, another spine came flying through the air, forcing its way straight into my right leg. I howled in pain, dropping the gun in the process. Somehow, I was still standing, though, and was fighting back the tears as I felt welling up. I was livid now, and picked the pistol back up, putting my tongue to the trigger. Bang! Bang! 2 shots exploded from the barrel of the weapon. The first one missed, kicking up a dust cloud as it dug into the ground somewhere in the distance. The second bullet found home. As the round made contact with the creature, it popped like a balloon, bits and pieces of it going everywhere. I couldn't take any more. I lost it. Between the pain in my leg and what I just witnessed, all of the events had led up to this point. I couldn't hold back anything now. I found the nearest bush, dead or alive, it didn't matter, and chucked at the little food that was in my stomach. Lily turned away from me in disgust. I was honestly surprised she didn't lose her stomach too, but I'm guessing she had her eyes closed when I shot the thing. I quickly pulled out another box of food, fancy buck snack cakes this time, and ate them without giving the appearance or the radiation a second thought. I would have liked to savor it more, but I just needed something to settle my stomach again, and it really didn't matter what it tasted like. When I finished, I wiped my mouth clean, holstered my gun, which had once again found ground, and sat down to look at my wound. The spine was still stuck there like a growth embedded in my skin. I had began to bleed lightly around it, though I knew the only reason it wasn't seeping out faster because of the spine itself plugging the hole. Lily, who had the healing potions, came over to me, with one held in her teeth. Even though my training told me not to, I began to slowly and painfully remove the spine. The only reason I went against his education was because we had the healing potion handy that would magically fix me up good as new. I'd never actually been shot before, so I didn't know what to expect beyond my manuals had said, and as I had guessed, the blood flow increased more as I pulled it out. Unfortunately, so did the pain. I whinnied and screamed the entire time, cringing with every millimeter it moved. Once the barb was free, I hastily wrapped a bandage around the wound and drank the healing potion Lily had brought to me. I felt its magic began to work, filling my body with happy, healing feeling, and in short order I was fixed up. Soon enough, we were on our way again. It was, however, beginning to get dark, and the sun began to set behind the mountains and the clouds. We had decided it would be much more hazardous at night, and considering how bad it was proving to be during the day, we hurried as fast as we physically could. Eventually we came across another site stretching along the perpendicular to our path. From horizon to horizon were 2 lengths of metal rails running in parallel with each other. Wooden beams crossed beneath them, tying them together. I knew what this was, though. It was an old world railroad. My eyes tracked along it with the fading light, first to the south, then back north. And that's when I saw it. There was a series of lights maybe a mile or 2 up the tracks. They were within walking distance. Lights meant ponies. Ponies meant shelter. The night was only a few minutes behind us, so we were eager to take our chances. We pushed onwards towards the welcome glow of civilizations, hoping our assumptions would be right. The dark finally set in, and it was just as awe-inspiring as our initial venture outside. The grey blanket above us had torn in several places, portals to what lay above, through which we could see even further beyond. The halls were deep and dotted with lights, some that flicked and others that didn't, and there was no time to stop and admire them. The lights on the ground were drawn near enough for us to tell what they were. Sure enough, it was a town that lay nestled between the railroad tracks and the mountains, and it was full of ponies, real ponies, living out here in the wastes. My thoughts turned back to the figure on the horizon. I only assumed it was one of the ponies from this town, and then a poke from my shoulder stopped me in my stride. Looking up, I jumped back in surprise. I had found myself face to face with a flat metal surface. Lily had stopped me before I'd ran into it, unlike back in the stable atrium. Stepping back from it, I could see it in full detail. It was nothing more than a rusty piece of sheet metal, fashioned into a sign, and attached to 2 stakes that had been crudely driven into the ground. The spray-painted writing on it read, "Welcome to Crossroads Junction. Elevation, here. Population, us." Footnote: Level up. New perk: Hunter. In combat, you do 75% more critical damage against animals and mutated animals.